Hello everybody and welcome to Nathan Unshuffled. I've got a really fun, exciting video today. I've been teasing it. I've been talking about this band so much, and finally I'm doing a big album ranking show for them. This is Big Big Train and the big album rankings. You can see all the Big Big Train albums behind me. Really been excited, and basically this show's just kind of gonna be my love letter to one of my favorite bands. So before I get into it, of course, the rules always apply that these are just my opinions, my choices from least favorite to favorite. I'm not saying these are the worst to best, really, because I think it's so subjective of what's worse and what's best. You know, to me, it's just about what are my least favorites to my favorites. I adore, especially the top half of this list. I really adore all these albums, so the ranking can be a bit arbitrary, and from day to day almost, it can change. So that's kind of where I'm at. So I'm going to jump into these rankings and hopefully you enjoy it. Big Big Train, of course, is a classic progressive rock band that was formed way back, I believe in like late 80s, early 90s, from Andy Poole and Greg Sponton, joined by Ian Cooper on keyboards, Steve Hughes on drums, and Canadian vocalist Martin Reed. And they had some earlier albums throughout that period, and there's been a lot of changes in the lineup, leading to kind of their more modern lineup that started with Underfall Yard and has developed ever since, adding on David Lungden, who's been such a integral member of the group since Underfall Yard, and of course Nick DiVirgilio on drums, and later Rickard Soderblom from Beardfish would join the group. Rachel Hall would be a member of the group. Just so many notable figures throughout their history as a band. Their sound has really developed, and that's kind of the message. The early albums, I'm really, probably like a lot of people, I really was an adopter of the band starting with Underfall Yard down here onward. So the albums before that are just ones I'm less familiar with, I'm less a fan of. So I'm going to go through those pretty quickly. That's going to easily be the bottom part of my list. So there's certain instances where it was a little bit difficult to decide what counted as an album. I try to just focus purely on studio albums, and to just make it an easy decision, I follow the studio albums that are listed on Prog Archives. So I'll get later to kind of why there's little bits of differences that may occur from that. So 13 studio albums, and so that's a lot to get through. Let's do it. So starting at number 13 at the bottom of the list for me is Bard from 2002. So Bard, it's kind of almost a forgotten album in their catalog. It's one that is kind of absent on streaming services. It's one I don't think the band talks about very often, but maybe is a little bit of a cult favorite from really diehard Big Big Train fans. But for me, listening to it, the music's pleasant, it's nice, it has this kind of general pastoral Genesis light kind of sound to it. But I don't find much to grab onto that's very notable in this album. It kind of drifts along. And that's kind of the message you'll hear from a lot of these early albums, is that they had some interesting stuff going on, and it's interesting to kind of hear these early elements that are already being at play in these early albums. But it's just, there's not enough things to hook me, I guess. You know, the melodies aren't as memorable. The hooks, I can't remember the songs after I hear them. There's kind of this melancholy feel that I feel like really permeates throughout their early albums that just isn't as nice to me as the kind of majestic feel of their later works. But there's some cool things here. There's some cool instrumental sections that kind of pepper throughout, that kind of add some variety and interest, that kind of help this melancholy feel a little bit. But I wish they were a little bit more often. You know, there's a great explosive moment in Broken English that's kind of notable because they finally burst in this interesting section with keyboards and things. But you know, it's a little bit laid back. Probably my favorite moment of the album is the closing part, you know, the last bit of For Winter, which I feel like is a bit overlong, but I like the ending of it, leading into a long finish, which is just a really great Genesis-inspired, you know, instrumental play out of the album that I really think is great. There's some cool jazzy flourishes to the album, some female vocals kind of complimenting Martin Reed, but beyond that, just not one of my favorites, so that has to sit at the bottom. So next on my list, another early album. This is in fact their first full studio album. This is Goodbye to the Age of Steam from 1994 at number 12. As much as it's interesting as kind of a piece of their history, I just wasn't really impressed listening through this time. It starts out okay. The first couple tracks were interesting to me. I thought, okay, there's something here. This could be actually a pretty cool album. And it's kind of a conceptual piece where one track kind of blends to the next, at least at parts, kind of giving this feel of a concept and narrative flow. But it doesn't really grab me overall. Just once again, similar to Bard, there's some great sections, there's some moments that are great, like I love that second half of Blow the House Down, so with some lively instrumental work, and things get a little bit more lively and interesting, but a lot of it is just really slow, and it doesn't grab me in much the same way as their later albums. The production isn't bad. The other thing is I listened for this one and an upcoming one, I listened to these albums, they have kind of redone versions of them, so I'm listening to newer versions, so they sound pretty good, but they're not quite up to snuff of the quality to me of what comes later. They're good albums. I don't want to trash on any of these albums because they're all fantastic. Taking this into account, they're all great albums, but I'm just trying to distinguish between their later period, and I prefer their later works. These early albums just don't grab me and aren't as memorable to me, and just have never really stuck with me as I've tried to listen to them. So next at number 11, kind of completing this early trilogy of albums, I'd say, is English Boy Wonders from 1997. So out of these early albums, this is the one that grabbed me the most by a pretty good bit. I really appreciated the makes here. It has that prog styling, the Genesis feel that's gonna continually keep being discussed. But there's kind of this almost poppier, like XTC kind of vibe also mixed in with that I think makes it stand out a little bit more than their other two albums from this earlier period. And I like some of, especially the kind of shorter tracks throughout that add a little bit of energy, have this kind of pop flavor. It kind of adds a cool variety. I like A Giddy Thing, Cloudless and Starry and Still. Mr. Box Groveman from later on is really cool. But like I said, the melodies aren't as memorable. A lot of the songs are a little bit forgettable for me, but they kind of intersperse some cool instrumental things, and they have a little bit more of a pop sensibility here that I kind of like. So not as good as what's to come, but out of these earlier albums, I think this is kind of a highlight of that period of the band. And I really like the re-recorded version. There's a re-recorded / remix version that they came out with in 2008, and that's the one I primarily was listening to. I think has a better track listing and just is a better flow of an album. So check out that one if you want to delve back into this, but just not really my preferred version of the band, really. So now we get into kind of this next stage of the band. I kind of view this in like these three periods. This is kind of the transitional period where they were starting to get a little bit more proggy, and we're kind of developing a little bit of a different style. So at number 10, I have The Difference Machine from 2007. This is kind of the second album of the two in this kind of mid-period, and I really liked this. I think this is the first album that I actually heard about when it came out, and where the first inklings of Big Big Train as a band were known to me because of the involvement of some of the Spocksbeard members. And of course, I have always been a huge Spocksbeard mega fan, so when I heard that Nick DiVirgilio and Dave Maros were playing on this album. That was intriguing, and so I definitely checked it out at the time. But it doesn't fully grab me. I like the opening. I like Perfect Cosmic Storm. I think it's a cool kind of fusion of different things. They're really trying to put a lot of different things into the music here that from compared to their earlier albums. So I give them a lot of credit for kind of almost giving this jazz fusion feel to some of these tracks and adding more elements, some saxophone. So I think that really helps, beef up the sound a bit more. But it just overall, it doesn't grab me as much. And it's spotty a little bit to me. There's some good tracks and some good moments, but overall it didn't leave a very strong impression on me as either. It says it's a concept album exploring chaos theory, communication, failure, death, loss, and bereavement. The story is the death of an individual which was linked to an exploding star in a distant galaxy. So kind of a crazy, expansive concept. They're introducing a lot of different influences on this one, and I love the inclusion of Dave Maros and Nick DiVirgilio, and I believe Pete Trewavas also is guesting on this. So it's a cool group, it's a cool vibe, there's a lot of great moments and some notable tracks, but overall it just doesn't grab me as much. So I don't know, it's an album that I feel like I should like more than I do, but it's just not memorable enough to really reach into the upper echelons of the music that I tend to prefer. Number 9 is Gathering Speed from 2004.
He waits for the word, the hard-edged word.
Once again, this one really impressed me. It's an album that I hadn't thought about. I don't know if I ever really listened to this beyond my dedicated listening to all the albums for this show. And I was surprised at how great it was. Of this mid-period, I think this is a really fantastic album. It's somewhat of a concept album about the airmen and women who lost their lives in the Battle of Britain. So they're kind of showing that British feel that would be such a hallmark of their prime period of albums to come. There's a bit of that Pastoral Genesis vibe again, with a lot of 12-string guitars and stuff. I really like the introduction of harmonica as kind of an interesting thing, or a blues harp, I'm not sure what to call it, but it's an interesting addition to their sound that I think started them on this idea of kind of introducing other elements to bring a bigger sound stage to their work, which I think would be even brought to better fruition later. But I like Fighter Command is a great little mini epic that I think really is a prototype for some of the big train epics to come. I really thought that was excellently done. Sky Flying on Fire had some great fiery instrumental work, and Pell Mell was an interesting track. Maybe certain of the longer tracks feel like they're a little slightly too long, but it's kind of nitpicking. But overall, I think it works really well as a full packaged album, more so than any other early period albums. And of course, the vocals from Sean Filkins kind of replacing Martin Reed are interesting. He has kind of almost a Fish vibe from Marillion, but it's really interesting music. I think this is a great album to explore if you want to delve backwards before Underfall Yard period. This is a really cool one with a great concept and great storytelling and a cool album that it's short and compact and works really well as a great little package. So now we move into the David Lungden period of the band, for the top 8 albums. And I love all these. These are all magnificent albums. So the ranking, don't get caught up in that. They're all great. I love all these to death. So at number 8, to me, the reason this is number 8, even though it has some incredible music on it, is just because of my confusion of, is this really a studio album or not? And that is the second Brightest Star from 2017. Now, it's listed here as a studio album, and I feel like the band did pretty much release it as a studio album, but it was kind of this surprise album that came pretty closely after Grimspound was released. And it to me, it feels more like a collection of extras, a collection of kind of reworked songs from Folklore and from Grimspound, and some additional cuts that didn't make those albums. So it always felt like kind of almost a bonus disc to those albums. And for that reason, I feel like I can't put it on the same level as some of their other main studio albums, because to me it doesn't quite fit as a studio album. But that being said, the music on here is just absolutely gorgeous. Just so many incredible cuts of music here, really featuring the voice of David Lungden. He's a fantastic vocalist. He gets a chance to shine on some of these kind of slower ballad type songs. Songs like Second Brightest Star and The Passing Widow, just beautiful opportunities for David Lungden to showcase that voice he has that's so great. And he even goes pretty low in his voice. He'll go a little bit lower in an upcoming album, but in Second Brightest Star, I just feel like he has this really kind of cool, deep tone to his voice. And there's some cool little instrumentals throughout here: Haymaking, London Stoned, Terra Australis Incognita. These are really cool tracks with some really great instrumental sections showcasing the band and their abilities. This is like kind of the peak of the lineup of the band, where everyone was involved, and it's really a cool lineup. And to see them showcase so much on this, the brass, the violin, the vocal harmonies, all of their staples of their modern sound are all here in spades. I just love The Leaden Stour. Is just such a great song. It's one of my favorite tracks from the band. To place it here is an interesting choice, but it's so great, so well done. And I love they do a little bit of, I don't know if I'd call it reworkings, but new versions of Brooklyn's and London Plain, which were on the Folklore album, really just adding kind of a instrumental introduction to these tracks to kind of expand them a bit more. And of course, this is the highlight of the album, but it's a little bit unfair because these are really tracks from other albums that are just being a little bit reworked a bit. So maybe that's why this album ranks a little bit lower, because it feels like kind of a rehashing of old material in a sense, but I appreciate and respect the way it's done. It's a wonderful listen. It's a great album. It just, unfortunately, just doesn't feel like a complete album as much as their other ones from this period of time. So that's why that has to sit at number 8. Now we get to number 7, and this one is Grimspound from 2017. Right over here. This is a fantastic album, and it's really hard to rank these. These top 7 are interchangeable. They're all great. They're all 5-star albums that I love to death because I love the band. I'm such a huge mega fan. But I'm putting this one just slightly below the others because at the time it was released, I really was in love with this album. I think I even made it my number 1 album for the year it came out in 2017. And I still adore it. I love so much about it. I love Brave Captain. I think that's such a great opener. One of their best openers that just really tells a great story about history and really has some great instrumental sections. It's really well made. I love A Mead Hall in Winter. I think is one of their best epics. Rickard Soderblom really stood up to the plate here and really worked hard to craft a great epic that feels unique for the band and gives that message that I think that's so inherent in the band, of this like real respect for science and art and history, and it's really explored in this track in such a beautiful way. I really love this track, but maybe it's ranked slightly lower because the tracks in between those to me have a variable quality. I mean, they're all good. And I really love, like, Grimspound. The title track is great. I love the Ivy Gate, which gives a chance for Fairport Convention's Judy Dybel to do kind of a duet with David Lungden. And it's really well made, well crafted. But maybe songs like Meadowland and Experimental Gentleman are maybe, and even As the Crow Flies, which is the final track, are not to the heights of some of their other material for me. They're good. I really enjoy them. It's not like I'm going to skip these, but maybe I'm just less enthusiastic about those tracks in comparison to the rest of the album. So maybe a bit disjointed, but all in all, fantastic music. Once again, showcases the band in a great place in their lineup. It just, all of the people are involved in it. It has a kind of a folky vibe. Another reason why maybe it ranks a little lower is because it doesn't really feature the brass section like their other albums do. It's more focused on acoustic guitar and violin, but it's nice for that. It kind of gives it its own unique feel and gives it this kind of classic quality and this folk vibe. So I really appreciate it. I think it's a brilliant album, but it ranks at number 7 right now. At number 6, I'm choosing the Grand Tour up here. This is a fairly recent album. This is from 2019, and it's a great concept of an album. It's inspired by the 17th and 18th century customs of a grand tour where young men and women traveled to expand the mind. Songs set in distant lands. They kind of went beyond the British landscape into, more parts of the world. There's a lot of, stuff in Rome and different history from different parts of the world. So this album really took them out of their box a little bit and made them expand, at least in lyrical content, to this. But it was still based in history and art and, literature and those types of things that are hallmarks of their lyrics and their style. So not wildly different, but I really like this album. I think it's really maybe it's a bit overlong. Maybe the problem here, why it's not ranked quite as high as the ones to come, is just that it has some great stuff on it, but I feel like some of it gets buried a little bit amongst all the wealth of material here. And Alive has never been one of my favorite tracks. I think it's a fun start to the album, but it's a little bit skippable compared to what comes later. But I love The Florentine, a beautiful song about Leonardo da Vinci, kind of in that Uncle Jack feel, but a little bit more proggy and expanded, kind of this prog folk tune that I think David Lungden really inspired, and has some great almost dual vocals between David Lungden and Nick D'Virgilio. Beautiful song, one of my favorites. But I feel like Roman Stone, as much as I feel like I should really love this track, it never has really grabbed me as much as their other epics, so I don't feel like it has the same connection with me as some of their other stuff, and I'm not quite sure why, because musically it's a great track. It just for some reason hasn't grabbed me and is not as memorable as some of their other epics. I love the kind of 1-2 punch of Pantheon and Theodora, which were written by Nick D'Virgilio for the group. Pantheon being this kind of almost jazz fusion inspired instrumental, and then Theodora being a beautiful ballad that is kind of well placed in the track list, I think. And then the highlights to me is kind of the second half of the album, the last few tracks. Ariel has always been a personal favorite of mine, just really unique in their catalog. It's more of the song cycle kind of style. It's different than most of their epics to me. It has these kind of pieces as it tells this story based on Shakespeare's Tempest. Great vocal melodies, sublime harmonies, kind of is the peak of that almost call and response vocals that I like from the band, where David Lungden will sing and then the rest of the singers will kind of be a chorus behind him. And it works well for this, almost giving this style of these muses kind of telling this ancient story. And it really gives it this kind of quality of mystery and of intrigue that I really appreciate. And just some of those melodies and harmonies are just so sublime. And Voyager is a great epic as well, with some great instrumental sections, and kind of reminds of like Brooklyn's and East Coast Racer. Has that kind of epic feel and has a cool concept as well, kind of taking this idea of exploration that's going throughout this album, exploring different lands and different moments in history and taking that almost out into space, is kind of a cool concept. And then Home Song brings it all home. So as I'm talking about, I'm like, why isn't this ranked higher? Because I obviously love this album. Every track is really great. It's really consistent. But for some reason, it just, because the classics are so classic, it's hard for me to put this above those. So, but I really love it. I think this is a fantastic album that deserves a lot of praise. So moving on to number 5, this is where I've put their new album, Common Ground, from this year.
And so it seems power is knowledge and time is an object
Now, I don't know if this placement's controversial or not. It was a difficult one to place, to be honest, because it's probably a bit too soon to really make this kind of a judgment about it. Of course, I have it behind me on my wall here. So it's so new. I've only heard it, I've heard it several times by now, but it's hard to place in their discography because, I haven't had time to sit with it and see where it really places. But I put it at this spot because I really do love it. I think it's a great leap forward for the band. I think it showcases them kind of branching out a bit more when their albums, maybe the complaint about Grand Tour and why it's low is just because it sounds so much like what came before it. It doesn't really, it doesn't hearken too much new musical ground. I guess Aerial is a bit of a different type of track, and there's a different, more expansive quality of the lyrics that they're doing, but a lot of the music in Voyager and Roman Stone and even the Florentine are things that you've kind of heard before by the band, but still really well done. In this album, they really try to expand a bit more, and I really respect them for that, especially the first half of the album. They're really kind of experimenting with different styles. Strangest Times is almost like a poppier Elton John inspired number. All the Love We Can Give has that low-voiced David Bowie type opening, which I know is kind of controversial. A lot of people don't like that, but I do like it. And I like Nick DiVirgilio's influence with the rest of the tracks, some almost Spock Spirit inspired instrumental work. Black with Ink is kind of a different style for the band, with these trading of the vocals, giving all the vocalists in the band a chance to shine. So, and it does move a little bit more into their typical lane in the second half with tracks, especially with Atlantic Cable, which is a very standard epic by the band, beautifully crafted, wonderfully done, but does harken back to the same epics of that length that have come before it. But I think there's even nuances and new stuff even in that second half of the album. Apollo is a great instrumental that I think brings new flavors out of the band that weren't really explored quite to that degree. It's a really great album that showcases a band trying to kind of pick themselves up from a troubling situation with the world and within the band, losing a lot of the band members and coming down to this like little four-piece when it was such an expansive band with so many different members. And they really picked up those pieces and made something really special. And the more I hear it, the more I love it. I almost considered putting this even one place even higher than this. I was really torn between this and the next album, what should be 5 and what should be 4. And I just decided this should stick at 5 for now. And as I listen more to the album, maybe it'll raise up a little bit. Maybe it'll lower a little bit. I'm not sure. But at this moment in time, this is how I feel about the album. I think it really deserves its spot in their catalog. And I've really been loving it, and I like the new styles that they're working with, but still having that classic sound, It's a great balance, because sometimes you can stray too far away from your classic sound and almost alienate your fans who love you for that sound. But if you stick too far into your sound and don't explore and do more with it, then you're getting stagnant, and it's like, well, I have all of the great music that came before this. What makes this special, to make it worth listening to? So I think they really walk that line really well, especially on this album. So that's why it's placed here right at number 5. So at number 4, this one has been raising in my estimation ever since it came out. It probably would have initially ranked a bit lower, but I've been really enjoying it, especially as the reissue came out and so forth. And that's the Underfall Yard from 2009 at number 4.
Still low light and ocean tides, the love you never meant to hide.
So I've got it down here. This is my copy, which I've shown off quite a bit. I did a whole review of it when I got it, and it's part of my vinyl haul video as well that I just did. But the more I listened to it, the more I realized that this is just a perfect album. This was the first album that featured David Lungden, and to me it's like the moment the band really found itself. When they really combined to make this sound that would make them such stalwarts in the prog genre, and to be such massive figures in the prog landscape. I think this is where it all started. This is where they really dialed in. And I think it would even be dialed in a bit more on the next pair of albums that we'll get to. But it's really a fantastic work that is pretty much a perfect album. As I'm listening to it, I'm like, I I can make minor quibbles here and there with certain things, but really, all being told, it's just really perfect. They really introduced David Lungden to the fold in a perfect manner with Evening Star, which like has this a cappella opening and then showcases so many musical themes that you'll hear, especially later on in Underfall Yard, the epic track. And you hear the brass section, and you get really introduced to this new wave of the band in this one track, and it's really well done. I think it's a great overture for what's to come. And then it has some great shorter tracks throughout, but really the masterpieces to me are Victorian Brickwork, which to me is the first true classic of the band. It's beautiful. It has this kind of old sensibility. It has this kind of pastoral old school Genesis feel, but it brings it to a new era. And I love the introduction of the brass section, just brings us to a whole nother level. It's just beautiful. It's majestic. It's a classic. Superb melodies. Just really one of the first tracks that made me fall in love with the band. I think it's just so well crafted and just such a great little kind of mini epic. And Winchester Diver, one of the shorter tracks, has always been one that's risen in my estimation. Wasn't one of my favorites to start with, but it's become one of my favorites. I really love the story behind the track. I love the sound of it. They kind of redid it in a way where it kind of begins, instead of with the keyboard sound, with this kind of brass sound that I think really elevates it. And it's a great track. And then of course comes the Underfall Yard, which is just a master epic by them. Maybe a minor complaint is that it could feel a bit overlong. I kind of like how their epics tend to range in this like kind of 12 to 15 minute. I think that's where their sweet spot is. So maybe this could do with a little bit of cutting down, but minor quibbles, because overall it's just really impressive and is a super great track that really showcases all aspects of the band. So, and like I said, the new remastered remix version adds some tracks. They do some new re-recordings of some of these classics with the new lineup of the band, so that adds to it. There's a new track, Brew and Berg, which is fantastic. So just really elevates it up a notch to me, and I think it deserves its placement here. It's a classic album. It brings such feelings of nostalgia. It really established them in their place in their lyrical content, exploring a lot of English-inspired stories, and it's a really beautiful album that I think deserves praise and attention. So moving from there, a personal favorite of mine, this one at number 3 is Folklore from 2016. So I love Folklore. It's always been a personal favorite of mine. I think it's beautiful and expertly crafted. It's so fantastic. And unfortunately, it's the one that I don't have on vinyl, and I'm crushed about it because I just saw in a post somewhere that doesn't sound like they're going to reissue it anytime soon. There's no plans for it, but I really wish they'd reissue it on vinyl. I just missed my opportunity. Maybe I'll keep looking for it. Maybe I'll come across it, but at the moment, it's pretty much impossible. I do, of course, have the CD version that I love and cherish, so it's not like I don't have it at all, but I really love this album with my full heart. I think it's a perfect album. I love the folky vibe that they introduced here. Every track hits hard, is perfect. London Playing and Brooklyn's are just masterful. They're just beautiful, shorter epics by the band that I think really showcase the band at their best. London Playing, I always like this kind of midsection because it's a very slow kind of ballad type song, and then it just like in an instant goes into this quicker kind of instrumental section that I've always, it always kind of shocks me when that comes up, and I just always loved that part to it. I love the brass arrangements in here. They really bring them to the full effect. I like the 1-2 punch of Along the Ridgeway and Salisbury Giant is a great, I feel like those work together as almost another mini epic. The Transit of Venus Across the Sun is so just beautiful with great vocals, great melodies and harmonies. Just such a beautiful track. Wassail is just a fun, almost Jethro Tull inspired romp. Just really a fun track. kind of leaning into the folk vibes of the album. And then Winky is kind of an underrated classic to me. I totally adore Winky. I think it's a perfect little prog song with so many, and it's somewhat short runtime. It has so many sections and feels, and it's just fun and rocking and gives the perfect vibe that the album needs after all these kind of slower paced, more beautiful, expansive tracks. But I think it provides that great balance and blend to have those kind of faster, quirkier moments interspersed with all this beautiful, luscious arrangements and beautiful melodies. So, and Telling the Bees is just a perfect poppy kind of closing track to end the album off with. I just love how it's structured. I love every piece of this album. I love every song. I like the storytelling. I like that concept that it's kind of this folklore. It's them telling these kind of epic folk stories, and I kind of love that. It's like they're kind of gathering around the campfire in the track Folklore and let us tell you these stories, you know. And the band is just, that's what they do. They tell stories. They're expert storytellers. And so that's why I love them. And this album's a perfect example of why I love the band, and maybe the one that I would present to someone who hasn't heard the band before. You know, here's a perfect example of what this band is and what they can accomplish. It's just really beautifully crafted and a perfect album for me. One of my all-time favorites. So now we move on to the top two, which is, it should be somewhat obvious, and it's somewhat predictable, I'm sure, that these are the top two. And it's a little bit controversial in my opinion, because this is English Electric. I'll just say it. I'll just kind of spoil it right away. I chose to review them, put them on this list as separate parts. There's part 1 and part 2. But they also combine them into a full version that I think is even better than the 2 parts separately. So if I was really to give you the top album, it would be that. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to keep them separated and consider them 2 separate albums, part 1 and part 2. So at number 2, I'm going to go with English Electric Part 2 from 2013. There's just, these albums are magical. There's no other way to put it. These English Electric albums, what's so special about them is just, it's the perfect, you know, the Underfall Yard is when they started this period in their band's history, and David Lungden was brought into the fold as a vocalist. But I think it's really, this lineup was solidified in English Electric. This is where David Lungden had more of, you know, a hand in writing the music as well, and gave his touch, which I think adds this kind of magic to the band that they didn't have before. And so the team of David Lungden and Greg Sponton is just like a magical combination, on the lines of like a, you know, Lennon-McCartney kind of combination coming together of these two kind of different people who have different, you know, styles, but they really pair together in an expert way. And I think these English Electric albums really showcase that pairing. And, you know, because these albums aren't like super progressive, if you really look at it, you know, there's not so many like crazy instrumental proggy moments, but they're interspersed throughout. It's not, you know, totally devoid of that, but I think it's more focused on these luscious melodies and really great hooks and great styles and sounds and arrangements. I think that's where the beauty of these albums come from. And so I'm kind of talking about them generally, but to talk specifically about part 2, of course, it starts with East Coast Racer, which is one of their big seminal tracks, just a beautiful epic length track from the band. Swan Hunter is a totally beautiful shorter track with some great orchestration that comes in the second half. Worked Out is a fun little rock song. Leopards is beautiful, like David Lungden is really, you know, it's almost syrupy and sappy in a sense, but it's in a good way. It's this kind of ballad-esque feel, but it has almost a soul vibe to it. You know, it's really beautiful. Keeper of the Abbeys is this great, like almost Irish folk-inspired song, you know, that has this great folk-inspired instrumental section, and then Permanent Way calls back to the part 1 of the album with some Hedgerow and even some Great Rebreather callbacks. And then Curator of Butterflies is just a beautiful finale that really brings it all together in such a beautiful, majestic way. So it's just a perfect little compact album once again. What I love about it is that there's variety. Each track is kind of its own world in a sense almost. You know, they kind of tell their own compact stories, but they all are kind of under the same umbrella of exploring the English landscape and talking about history and about people within that countryside. It's really focusing on different industrial parts of their history and different pieces of some of the more pastoral sections and some of the more like beautiful parts of the landscape, and then some of the more gritty, like here are the workers and what they did, and you know, it really explores all you can expect from that English experience. And I, as someone who's not from there, you know, it's a cool way to explore that countryside in my opinion. I think it feels so much inspired by that, and I just really love the sound of it. I think it's really beautiful, and they really focus a lot on bringing in other arrangements and other things, and you know, bringing in other instruments, bringing in brass and violin. You know, they experimented with that a bit on Underfall Yard, but this is where it really comes to its full fruition. This is where they introduce the brass section to its full entirety. There's violin, there's an accordion, banjo, you know, all these different instruments and styles and sounds that gives you a varied listen, but it all still feels like it's conceptual and under that same concept. So excellent, beautiful music. And then, of course, number 1 is English Electric Part 1 from 2012. This is such an excellent album. Perfect album, sparked my love for the band. You know, I liked Underfall Yard. I had it. I listened to it a lot. I thought it was great. But this was where they became one of my all-time favorite bands, was with English Electric Part 1. And every track is perfect. First Free Breather is kind of like that classic Genesis style. Almost sounds like it could come straight from, like, you know, Trick of the Tail or something like that. Then it goes into Uncle Jack, which is a total left turn, kind of this folk-inspired song with banjo and just really interesting instrumentation, but it's such a beautiful song, so well recorded. Just continues from there. Judas Unrepentant is so perfect and great. Summoned by Bells is a beautiful proggy song with a lot of stuff going on in the arrangement. Upton Heath is another cool, like, shorter, folkier style song. And then the final of the album, A Boy in Darkness, it has this kind of drenched melancholy to it and this kind of darkness to it, but it's really big and dramatic and beautiful in its expression. I just really love that one. And then Hedgerow's a beautiful song, just a perfect kind of almost pop inspired ending with that brass section being utilized almost in a Beatles inspired way. And once again, it's just a great subject matter. It just makes this such a great listening experience. It's like you're walking back in time through the English countryside, you know, watching these pastoral vistas and hearing of some of the working conditions of people of that era and the pioneering exploits of people who are trying to expand in the human condition. It's a beautiful album that really symbolizes the band. And if I could put it at number 1, really the number 1 album is this. The full power version, which combines these two albums into one and adds a bunch of extra tracks and really shuffles the track listing around in a way that's pretty brilliant. And this is one of my favorite all-time albums, is this English Electric full power version. And along those lines, before I close out, I wanted to mention a few other kind of honorable mentions that aren't really part of their catalog, at least they're not full-length studio albums. There's, of course, the brilliant Far Skies Deep Time EP, which to me should really be a full album. You know, it's a long EP, almost an album length anyways. You know, and it has Kingmaker on it, and it has an epic track on it. It's a really great EP that really belongs in their catalog with all this other stuff. To me, it's a great companion to, like, Underfall Yard period. And I really love that. And of course, they have several notable live albums. I have one above me here, Merchants of Light. And then I also have kind of the Blu-ray version here, Reflectors of Light. You know, they're an incredible live band, so their live material is so great. I have their more recent Empire, which is a fantastic live performance. They're just so great in every aspect, and I hope beyond hope that they are going to come tour the US and come somewhere near me. I think they're planning on it, but I haven't heard any dates yet or any more information on that, so I'm just hoping that they come close to me, because they're kind of a bucket list band to want to see live, because I know how impressive they are with their live configuration. And so I just love this band with my whole heart. Hopefully, I think that's pretty obvious from this lengthy video that goes through their discography. I just love the band. Don't get hung up on my rankings. They're my own personal favorites. Like I said, all the albums with David Lungden on vocals are amongst my favorite all-time albums, so the ranking is a little bit arbitrary in that way. But please put in the comments your rankings. You know, how would you put together a list of these albums? You know, what do you think is the best Big Big Train album? You know, how do you feel about their earlier period of the band? Maybe you have a bit more nostalgia, or you knew the band back in those days and have better feelings about those older albums. Because I really struggled with that this time around, trying to appreciate that older period of the band that I'm not as big a fan of, if I'm being honest. So there you have it. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you've gotten this far, you must be a Big Big Train fan yourself, so I appreciate that. Please subscribe to my videos as usual. You know, I really love talking about these bands, and there's lots more to come, I'm sure, about Big Big Train and other notable prog bands. So thank you guys so much, and please just keep enjoying the music. That's all I really care about, is that you have good music and that you're enjoying listening to it. That's really all I'm here to promote. So thank you guys, and I'll see you in the next video, hopefully. Bye.